In the spring of 2004, 27-year-old police officer Steven Rios was as straight as an arrow, both sexually and professionally. At least that's what everyone thought. But things took a bizarre, erratic, and ultimately deadly turn that summer shortly after he arrested a handsome and sexually active young student named Jesse Valencia at a loud party in Columbia, Missouri. Before we begin, we would like to express our most sincere sympathies to the victim's friends and family. Jesse Valencia was born on February 22, 1981 in the small town of Perryville, Kentucky, about 40 miles or 64 kilometers southwest of Lexington. His mother, Linda, was only 21 years old at the time. She and Jesse's father split up shortly thereafter. Linda started dating again when Jesse was just a toddler, but their bond was so tight that she only went out with men who agreed to let him come along. Jesse was a smart, inquisitive, and outgoing child. He spoke his mind from a very early age, and as a teenager, he never tried to hide his homosexuality. He didn't go out of his way to flaunt it, but was definitely not ashamed of it either. Being out and proud in a small Bible Belt town like Perryville took a lot of guts, and Jesse's friends and family members admired his confidence and courage. In many respects, Jesse and his mom were best friends. They spent a lot of time together talking about Jesse's dreams, his plans for the future, and his romantic relationships. Jesse worked as a model after high school, but eventually went off to the University of Missouri in Columbia, about 450 miles or 725 kilometers from Perryville. This was a huge deal because nobody in his family had ever graduated from college. Jesse studied pre-law and journalism and wanted to be a full-fledged attorney one day. True to form, he studied hard and got a job as a front desk clerk at a motel near campus to earn extra money. He also made a lot of friends, did his fair share of partying, and had a number of sexual partners. Things were going well, and Jesse was having the time of his life. That said, things took an unexpected turn on the night of Sunday, April the 18th, 2004, when the police raided a loud party he was attending. It's unclear just how much Jesse had to drink that night, but he mouthed off to Officer Steven Rios and ended up getting arrested for a charge similar to obstruction of justice. Officer Rios was only a few years older than Jesse, and he made polite small talk and asked him a number of personal questions on the way to the station. Jesse was released later that night, but to his surprise, Officer Rios showed up at his apartment on Wilson Avenue just a few days later. He said he was there on official police business and he just needed to ask a few questions about the incident at the party. But before long, the young college student from Kentucky and the well-respected public servant were having a steamy relationship. Jesse told his mother and friend, Joan Sheridan, that he was involved with a police officer and they regularly had relations while he was on duty. Even so, Jesse only referred to his new lover as Columbia's finest. This may have been because he wanted to protect his identity. But as hard as it may be to believe, he may not have known his name himself. Whatever the case, he was apparently under the impression that the officer would get the charges dismissed in exchange for sexual favors. By all accounts, Jesse and Officer Rios were into one another in the early going. On one occasion, they even had a threesome with another one of Jesse's partners named Andy Shimmerhorn. Afterward, Officer Rios told them how important it was to keep the whole thing a secret. Then, a few weeks into the relationship, Jesse told his mother that the mystery officer was stalking him and that he was abusing his position of authority. As an outspoken pre-law student, this rubbed Jesse the wrong way. He eventually came to the realization that the officer had no intention of getting the charges dismissed. Then he found out that the officer was married and that he and his wife had their first child just a few months earlier. But at that point, he made up his mind to out the officer by reporting him to his superiors. But first, he attended a party on campus after his shift at the hotel on the night of Friday, June the 4th, 2004. Like usual, he had a few drinks and hung out with his friends. Before leaving sometime after midnight, he made plans to meet up with one of his regular hookups named Ed McDivitt. They spent a few hours together at Jesse's apartment. Ed left shortly after 2 a.m., but Jesse was not ready to call it a night. He called another sexual partner multiple times, but the other person never answered the phone. We may never know exactly what happened after that, but Jesse had a brief interaction with an unknown visitor at his front door sometime between 3 and 5 a.m. It's unclear if the meeting was cordial in the early going, but Jesse eventually fled into the darkness wearing only a pair of swim trunks. The assailant was close on his heels, and moments later they had a violent altercation in the narrow alley between two houses a few hundred yards away from Jesse's apartment. The following afternoon at 2:10 p.m., University of Missouri student Matthew Franukin and a friend of his made a gruesome discovery as they were leaving their apartment to attend a graduation party in St. Louis. Just a stone's throw away, they found a partially clothed young man lying in an eerily awkward position in the alley. They approached cautiously because at that point they didn't know who he was or what had happened. But as they got closer, they saw a gaping wound around the victim's neck. As far as they could tell, it looked like someone had slashed his throat with a razor or an exceptionally sharp knife. They immediately called 911 and backpedaled away because they didn't want to contaminate the crime scene. Steven Rios was one of the first officers to arrive at the scene a few minutes later. This was a little odd because he was off duty as of 5 a.m. that morning. Nonetheless, he volunteered to guard the body until crime scene technicians and homicide detectives got there because he just happened to be in the area when the call went out. The victim was quickly identified as University of Missouri pre-law student Jesse Valencia. By the time first responders began setting up privacy shields, a crowd of curious neighbors had gathered to gawk at the macabre spectacle. Jesse's back, chest, and shoulders and neck were covered with bruises. He had obviously been involved in a fierce struggle, but the gaping wound seemed to indicate the crime was personal in nature. They were pretty sure that the perpetrator knew the victim and harbored some deep-seated hatred towards him. It was just a theory, but it seemed to be confirmed when the autopsy revealed the killer applied so much force to the cutting that it actually nicked Jesse's spine. Jesse's mother, sisters, and friends were devastated when they found out that he was gone and that he had been murdered in such a brutal fashion. Meanwhile, investigators discovered that a neighbor reported hearing a loud argument near Jesse's apartment around 4 a.m. that morning. Another witness reported seeing a barefoot young man walking down the street crying at about the same time. These reports were suspicious, but investigators weren't able to determine if they had anything to do with Jesse's death. Considering the apparently personal nature of the crime, they focused on interviewing Jesse's friends, co-workers, and lovers. Ed McDivitt was a person of interest because Jesse's friends told investigators they had a casual sexual relationship. Ed came clean and admitted to having sex with Jesse the day before he was killed. He swore up and down, though, that he didn't have anything to do with his death. Investigators also questioned Ed's roommate, Eric, and they were a little surprised to find out he showed some disdain for Jesse. He even told them that he didn't care if Jesse was dead, but he and Ed were both cleared of any wrongdoing. Investigators also questioned 19-year-old Zev Feintuch, who Jesse jokingly referred to as his boy toy. Phone records showed that Zev called Jesse multiple times the morning he died, but he told investigators that he was straight and they were just friends. Zev was eventually cleared as well, but investigators got a big break when Andy Schimmerhorn told them that Jesse had been having an affair with a police officer. This was a big surprise to say the least, and at that point they weren't even sure that the claim was true. Either way, they had to keep the potentially explosive information under wraps until they could verify the claim and identify the officer. But this was easier said than done, because Steven Rios eventually found out that a police officer was a suspect in the case. Almost immediately, he went to his supervisors and gave them the names of two fellow officers who he claimed exhibited suspicious behavior. Unfortunately for investigators, Andy Schimmerhorn did not know the officer by name. However, he told them about the threesome that he and Jesse had with the officer and that he would recognize him if he saw him. They asked Andy to come to the station to see if he could identify the officer by looking through the police department's yearbook. He agreed, and his jaw nearly hit the floor when Steven Rios walked down the hall as he and the investigators were entering the interrogation room. When they were alone, Andy told them that he just saw the man that he and Jesse had their interlude with. Shortly after the chance encounter, Steven Rios went to the Columbia police detective John Short and told him that he knew Jesse because he had arrested him at a party several months before. Nonetheless, he denied having an inappropriate relationship with him. Investigators had to tread lightly because Steven Rios was a popular officer with an exemplary service record. But they couldn't just clear him as a suspect because he wore a uniform. And as the investigation continued, additional witnesses confirmed that he was sexually involved with Jesse Valencia. Officer Rios eventually broke down and copped to the affair under hard questioning from Detective Short, but he still denied having anything to do with Jesse's death. He even added that he couldn't have killed Jesse because he was drinking beer with fellow officers Jason Jones and Alan Young and a few others on the roof of the police station until approximately 5 a.m. that morning. To their surprise, investigators verified this by examining electronic records which showed that he used his ID card to enter a restroom just before 5 a.m. Officer Rios denied having anything to do with Jesse's death, but he had no choice but to come clean to his wife when the news of the affair leaked out and wound up in the local news. Officer Rios' wife promised to stick by him, but as his world imploded, he told his superiors that he needed to take a break and that he was going to visit his father in Virginia. But instead, he drove to a Walmart near Kansas City and bought a shotgun and threatened to take his own life. Officers talked him down before he pulled the trigger, but afterwards, Captain Zim Schwartz had him committed for a psychiatric evaluation. But Steven Rios made even more waves a few days later when he threatened to jump from the top of a towering parking garage on top of the psychiatric hospital. This time, Detective Short was dispatched to the scene to defuse the situation. But when he got there, Officer Rios told him in no uncertain terms that he didn't want to talk to him. Detective Short left immediately, but other officers eventually persuaded Steven Rios to back away from the precipice. According to Detective Short and then Police Chief Randy Boehm, his actions were a clear indication of guilt. They still didn't have any proof that he killed Jesse Valencia, but from there the case against him got stronger and stronger. Fellow officers told Detective Short that Steven Rios didn't hang out with them on the roof until 5 a.m. that morning like he said he did. In fact, they claimed he left hours earlier. This was confusing because it contradicted the timestamp made by Officer Rios' ID card when he swiped it before entering a bathroom a few minutes before 5 a.m. Whatever the case, investigators also learned that a number of females had accused Officer Rios of soliciting sexual favors in exchange for dropping or reducing their charges. With these new developments, investigators asked the coroner to take another look at Jesse's autopsy report to see if anything important had been missed the first time around. Lo and behold, the bruising around his chest, neck, and shoulders suggested the killer subdued him using a classic law enforcement chokehold that Steven Rios and his fellow officers had been taught and used regularly. The medical examiner couldn't definitively determine what kind of cutting instrument was used to make the gaping wound in Jesse's neck, but it was consistent with the blade of a belt or clip knife like the one many officers on the Columbia police force carried. Up until then, the evidence against Steven Rios was largely circumstantial, but that changed when lab tests proved that hairs found on Jesse's chest and DNA under his fingernails belonged to him. Steven Rios was arrested and charged with first-degree murder on July 1, 2004, but his trial did not begin until the following spring.
May it please the court.
Counsel.
Ladies and gentlemen, the state's evidence is going to prove that this defendant, Steven Arthur Rios, on June 5th, 2004, a Saturday, killed a young man, a 23-year-old college student named Jesse Valencia, by cutting his throat. There were no eyewitnesses to this murder, but you will see that it is proven by DNA. It is proven by science. As you will see from the evidence that the killer left his DNA on the chest of the victim in the form of hairs from the killer's body and under the fingernails of the victim. You're going to hear that this defendant committed this murder out of lust and blind ambition. You're going to hear that he was a politically ambitious police officer with the Columbia Police Department who had started having a secret love affair with this victim, Jesse Valencia. You're going to hear that he was a married man and a police officer but yet he had started this love affair, this secret sexual relationship with Jesse Valencia about 7 weeks earlier on the night of April 18, 2004. You will hear that that was the night he had arrested Jesse Valencia in connection with a loud college party. That the affair began that night. He had used his badge to start the affair. You'll hear he used his knife. You will hear from approximately 60 or so witnesses, or maybe even more, during the next few days. And you'll see 150 exhibits or more, most of them photographs. And you will hear from witnesses that include Jesse's friends. And they will tell you that Jesse was 23 years old. He was a college student at the University of Missouri Columbia. He was majoring in political science and history, and his long-term goal was to be a law student. And you'll hear that, like many college students, he liked to go to parties. Like many college students, he liked to drink. But unlike most college students, he was not heterosexual. He was homosexual. He was gay. And they'll tell you, his friends will tell you, that he was almost stereotypical in his gayness, and that from the time he was speaking, from the way he talked, from the way he walked, from the way he dressed, it would be obvious to anyone who met him, or it would be obvious to anyone who arrested him, that he was gay.
Opening statement for the defense.
Lying. That's what we did serve for an hour and 15 minutes. Mr. Morley, Mr. Swingle is a gifted storyteller, and he just weaved a tale for you. And as gifted storytellers, he embellishes what we did, he shades what we did. He has a story he wants you to get. So he makes sure that the points he needs to make get you to the story he wants you to hear. Yes, my client had gay sex with Mr. Valencia. Yes, my client lied about it. When all this comes out over the next several days, pardon me for the case, I can't stand still like that, Mr. Swingle. When all this comes out in the next 3 or 4 days, I'm confident you're going to go, yes, the statements are burdened beyond a reasonable doubt that man, my client, Steven Rios, had sex with Mr. Valencia and then lied about it. Well, after, when Christopher Kettner heard the rumble next door, Mr. Rios, Officer Rios, swipes his card to go to use the restroom. Irrefutably. We have the records. Went to use the restroom. 1, 2 minutes. Depending on how vain he is, that he stopped in front of the mirror and all that. Then he goes back on down the road. You are going to hear testimony from Jason Jones, a Columbia Police Department officer, who said that sometime after 4:40, 4:45, he notices day is breaking. Uses a couple different terms in different sworn testimonies. Dawn, day breaking, I saw light. And that was their cue that it was time to go home. Then you're going to hear definitive evidence that at 4:57, Leah Wooden, who had just left the roof, called Jason Jones on his phone. They were an item and they were planning on getting together. 4:57, there is no ifs, ands, and buts about that. Jason Jones got that phone call about 2 minutes away from the police department. 2 minutes. So I'm going to tax your math. 4:55. He leaves the room. And Jason Jones, in sworn testimony, says that Steven left 2 to 4 minutes before me. 4:50, 4:51, 4:52. The struggle that dislodged an air conditioning unit, the struggle that caused multiple bruises, this struggle where this young man stood up for himself and fought for his life. 15 minutes after that happens, they want you to believe that this man walked into his house, no sweat, no breath stains, no blood, no scratches on his arms, on his legs, on his face. I wrote these down. Nothing out of the ordinary. You know why? Because he didn't kill Michelle.
Matthew Finucane was one of the first witnesses to testify because he and his friends found Jesse's body on the afternoon of Saturday, June the 5th, 2004.
Sir, state your name to the jury, please.
Matthew James Finucane.
And what is your current occupation?
I am the manager of a kennel in New York City and also a stand-up comedian by night.
But back in June of 2004, where did you live?
I lived at 1513 Wilson here in Columbia.
Where is the address where you lived compared to 1414 Wilson Street?
It is across the street and maybe 5 houses down, 5 houses east.
Now, I understand that you were one of the people who found the body of Jesse Valencia,
Yeah, I was one of 4 people.
and describe about what time of day it was.
It was the afternoon. It was a long time ago, but I would say 1 or 2 o'clock, probably something like that.
And how did it come about that you found the body?
I was getting ready to leave for a friend's graduation party in St. Louis, and 2 of my friends came to pick me and my roommate up, and we met them outside, and they kind of pointed me to where Mr. Valencia's body was laying.
And where was he compared to your house?
He was between my house and the house next door, in a little alley between the 2 houses.
And how close did you get to his body?
Initially, I would say 10 or 15 feet. We didn't need to get too close. It was pretty obvious that he wasn't alive.
What did you do?
Called the police.
And
Shortly thereafter, Detective Alan Bell described what went on at the crime scene in the early going.
did you get a call to respond to a body that you found?
Yes, I did.
And what time did you get that call?
We got the call about 2:10 in the afternoon.
And when you responded, describe what was happening, who was there when you got there.
I was at the scene until approximately 5:15 p.m. When I got to the scene, my Sergeant Ken Smith had already arrived on the scene. There were numerous firefighters and ambulance personnel on the scene as well, and then a few civilians.
And would you take a minute to describe what you could see the body when you got there?
When I got there, the deceased was located between 2 buildings, 1513 Wilson Avenue and 1517 Wilson Avenue. The body was undressed except for a pair of shorts and was just laying between the 2 buildings.
What sort of wound, if any, did you see?
There was a wound to the neck on the right side.
What steps, if any, did you take toward making sure people didn't get anywhere near the body?
Well, when I first arrived on the scene, once we established that the person there was in fact deceased, went ahead and assisted with other officers in putting up crime scene tape and barricades.
And from the time that you got there at 2:10 until 5:15 p.m., did this defendant Rios ever cross that area and get anywhere near the body that you could see?
I never observed Mr. Rios at the scene.
Now, I have a blank calendar of the months of April, May, and June of 2004. On the spot where June 5th appears, would you just with your own hand here write 210 body found and put your initials? Thank you.
Next, forensic investigator Dory Burke took the stand.
Did you respond to the scene of the body of Jesse Valencia on Saturday, June 5th, 2004?
Yes, I did.
And about what time of day did you respond?
Late afternoon.
When you got there, was the crime scene tape already put up, keeping people out from the area where the body was?
Yes, it was.
And did you wait while Detective Nichols was photographing the scene before you crossed that tape?
Yes, I did.
And in fact, as this photograph and its previous introduced in evidence, Statement 14, does this show you and Dr. Al waiting?
Yes, it does.
Where is Dr. Al? Where are you?
Dr. Rao's right there. I am right there.
Now, once they were through taking photographs, describe what role you did.
Cross the tape, photograph, the scene, all around the scene, plus the body. And then Dr. Rao came in and did her thing as far as looking at him, and then we bagged him and left.
And did you and Jeff Pickles, were you the ones that were bagging the body? Do you recall who did bagging the body?
I don't recall. I mean, there were 2 or 3 people helping.
Now, prior to Dr. Rao actually doing the autopsy, were you present when Jeff Nichols was collecting trace evidence?
Yes, I was.
Would you describe to the jury what happened with the collection of trace evidence, what you saw?
Trace evidence, there was a white box, a little bitty white box. I held the box for Jeff while he went from here, midsection of the body, and collected trace evidence off the body. And I held the box as he did that, put it in there.
Now, where did the box come from?
He brought the box.
And once physically, were you the one holding it?
Yes, I was.
And using this sample box states Exhibit 97, would you describe, show the jury how you held it while he was putting evidence in? Like that?
It was either like this or this. This was not broke.
And you don't remember whether you had it pulled all the way out or not?
No, I don't.
And you had not noticed whether any flap was broken?
None were broken.
Now, did you specifically count the pieces of trace evidence he was putting in the box?
No, it wasn't.
And could you see that part of the trace evidence he was collecting consisted of hairs?
Yes.
And what's your ballpark estimate of the number of hairs that you saw collected?
More than 1, less than 6. I didn't count.
Early testimony wasn't particularly dramatic considering the horrific nature of Jesse's death, but prosecutors were patiently setting the stage for more incriminating testimony that was about to be delivered by law enforcement trainer Todd Burke and medical examiner Dr. Valerie Rao.
The unilateral vascular neck restraint, also known as the unilateral neck restraint or shoulder pin, is a method of controlling people that are highly resistive. It's considered a use of force along the lines with a punch or any type of restraint. It is designed to subdue and immobilize people that are resistive by controlling their upper body, their head, and their neck, and if necessary, rendering them unconscious by squeezing them firmly and inhibiting the blood flow from their body to the brain.
Now, first of all, without demonstrating yet, but just verbally painting a picture, I describe to the jury how the unilateral vascular neck restraint works.
The restraint is designed to work against blood flow. There's 2 types of restraints: respiratory restraints or chokes that work against the airway. That is not what this is. And vascular neck restraints, and that is what I'm describing now. It is applied circumferentially around a person's neck or from underneath the arm and around their neck to apply circumferential pressure around the neck and the upper body. It does several things. It inhibits the blood flow from the brain to the body and the body to the brain. It can stimulate the vagus nerve of the heart by putting pressure on the neck, and there's receptors in the neck that send messages to the vagus nerve of the heart. It can also cause what's called the Valsalva maneuver, which is akin to grunting or holding your breath and bearing down, which pressurizes the chest and also inhibits blood flow. The technique is applied in 3 steps. The first step is called rear lock with no compression, where I'll simply grab Mr. Swingle and lock in. The second part, if necessary, is called compression until conscious compliance, where I would actually start to squeeze until he stopped resisting and became unconscious. And then the third step is the takedown, where I would step to the rear and he would essentially wind up in the seated position, and I would continue to apply the technique until he stopped fighting. So step 1, rear lock with no compression. I would step in and I would lock in underneath his armpit and clasp my hands on the side of his neck. And this is where I would apply pressure. My head is behind his head. My shoulder is in his armpit. Push his arm up into his his neck, and I would rock this hand down into the opposite side of his neck to squeeze everything. This is just locking in. Step 2 is compression until conscious compliance, where I would squeeze until he obeyed the commands or stop resisting. And then step 3 is to go to the ground. So we're going to step back into the sit on the ground. Get down, down. Until he became unresponsive.
Did you respond to the scene where Jesse Valencia's body had been found sometime after 2:10 p.m. on Saturday, June 5th of 2004?
Yes.
And describe for the jury what was going on when you got there.
I arrived about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a Saturday, and we had to wait because we had to wait for the police to take all their initial photographs. We did not want to disturb the body so that the photographs of as is taken. So we hung around a bit, and then when all that was over, I looked at the body and I saw a young man, very slim-built young man, lying face up on the grass with his right leg. He was dressed in swimming trunks, but they were dry, they were not wet, and his right leg was extended away from his body, and there was a lot of blood coming from a wound he sustained in his neck, and there were a whole lot of flies on his body. As we were there, we could see the flies sitting on the bloody areas.
First of all, is if you would maybe use the clarification diagram to just go through for the jury. Where did you find any sort of cuts?
Okay. I tried to kind of vary the color depending on the type of injury, but I didn't have that many colors available, so you have to bear with me. But this is the cause of death on his neck, the incised wound.
Let me pause with the diagram for a moment and have you take a moment to elaborate for the jury. What did you find about that wound as far as its size?
Okay, just for accuracy's sake, I'm going to have to give you exact dimensions so you get an idea. Okay, and if you look at my body, I will go through the injuries on my body so you can see. So he had a horizontal cut to his neck going about there. And the size of this wound, this particular wound was about 10 to 11.5 inches from the top of the head and about 1.5 inch from this little depression right here. His depression was more than mine because I'm kind of chubby. And what this wound, the wound was gaping, as a result of which it had an oval kind of look to it. And the injury was 6.5 centimeters, about 4-something inches, sharp margins. This part, this side of the wound had 2 skin tags that were sticking out right here. And these tags were attached to the main wound. And from this part, he had a few other incised wounds. And there was this area, very small area. I have documented that the 2 centimeter width abrasion. Abrasion is when the skin is rubbed off. Incised signifies sharp, like a knife wound. So if I talk about these injuries, you get the idea of what I'm talking about. And there was a very small area where you could see there were 3 parallel lines on that edge of that wound. And when I opened to see what this cut had done, there are muscles. If I turn my neck like this, you have these 2 big muscles that come down. So these 2 bellies were cut. And then you have jugular veins, external and internal jugular veins that are rather large veins coming from the head and neck area. Those were both cut. And then on this side, it goes deeper. It goes into the thyroid gland, which sits right here. And then it made a nick on his spine. So that's where the incised wound ended, by nicking the spine on the front.
Next, Jesse's friend Jennifer Glenn helped the prosecution establish a timeline of Jesse's movements in the hours leading up to his death.
Ballpark-wise, do you have any idea what time it was?
No, I'm sorry.
The circumstances of his leaving, who did he leave the party with?
He basically left my house and he was walking with Ed. And as they crossed about the street halfway, another gentleman joined them, and all three of them walked together the rest of the way across the street.
And was the Ed that he left with the same Ed that he had met at the SoCo Club the night before that you'd driven home?
Yes.
And so then Jesse's gone for a while?
Yes.
I guess your party wound up then for the evening?
We were up for a little bit, but it pretty much dwindled off as it started to get early in the morning.
And I'd like to draw your attention in around 3 o'clock in the morning. Did you end up seeing Jesse and Ed again at some point?
Yeah, actually, I had, it was pretty much everyone was gone, and I was just kind of cleaning up a little bit and getting ready for bed. And I had a studio apartment, so my bed was actually right by the front window, which was by the door. And I looked out the street and I saw Jesse and Ed right across the street because there was a big light.
And what were they doing when you saw them?
Just talking, from what I could tell, yeah.
And how did that end up as far as what you saw personally?
Well, they were talking for maybe a minute at the most that I saw, and then Jesse walked towards my house, and then Ed walked from what I assumed was to his apartment.
And did he walk in the same direction as Jesse's apartment or a different direction from where Jesse was?
The same direction.
Now, after Ed had left, did you end up seeing Jesse again?
Yeah, I saw that Jesse was walking back over to my house, so I went outside and we talked outside on the porch for a little bit. I said I was tired, and I went back in the house, and Jesse went down the stairs back towards his house, the direction towards his house.
What had Jesse's demeanor been at that time? Did he seem just fine and normal?
Yeah, he seemed just fine. He never really seems like he wants, to go home type of thing. He just really likes to be around people.
After Ms. Glenn testified, the prosecution called Detective John Short.
Sir, would you state your name for the jury, please?
John Short.
What is your occupation?
I'm a detective with the Columbia Police Department.
And what were you doing that Saturday before Jesse's body was found?
I was actually at the St. Louis Zoo with my family.
And did you get paid for beats or something?
Yeah, now Captain Steve Monticelli called me and told me that I needed to come back. So I came back.
Did your whole family then come back to Columbia?
Yeah.
And describe for me what time then you arrived at the scene or wherever you ended up arriving.
It took a couple hours to get home, obviously. Took the family home, got my detective car, drove in, and I was told to go to the intersection of Wilson and William, I believe it was.
And from that point forward, from that afternoon of Saturday, June 5th of 2004, for the next couple of weeks, did you pretty much work in this case every day?
Yes, I did.
And both during the regular hours and in evenings as well?
Evenings, weekends, pretty much around the clock.
And how many people would you estimate that you personally ended up interviewing in the course of this investigation?
Well, I counted them. I interviewed close to 30 people before it was over with.
And was one of the people you interviewed this defendant, Steven Rios?
Yes, it was.
And when and where did that interview take place?
That interview actually took place on the 5th, I believe, or on the 8th, and at the Columbia Police Department Major Crimes Unit.
And had this been something you were planning to do that morning?
No, it was not.
And how did it come about that you ended up participating in that interview?
I was already at the office, and Captain Monticelli notified me, he was my sergeant at the time, that the defendant had come to the police department, and specifically to our unit, to want to talk to us. So we prepared to do that.
And at the beginning of that interview, did you advise Steven Rios of his Miranda rights?
Yes, sir, I did.
And this form's already been introduced, 125. Do you recognize that as being the advice rights form that was used with him?
Yes, sir.
Now, did he waive his rights and agree to talk with you?
Yes, he did.
describe then for the jury how that interview began as far as what was said.
Well, after the Miranda was performed and he signed his waiver willing to state he was willing to speak to us, I asked him how he became to know Jesse Valencia and how he'd met him. He stated that in the month of April, he had arrested Jesse on an obstructing the government operation, basically I call that getting in a police officer's way kind of charge. He arrested him, and he stated that he saw him after the arrest. He saw him about 2 weeks after that. The defendant stated he was driving down Wilson Street. He was flagged down by an unknown individual, and this unknown individual told him of a particular apartment there was a problem at. The defendant stated he responded to that apartment, and he saw Jesse again where he had answered the door and found that there was a second individual in the house, but he didn't know who that individual was. After that, I asked him if that was the last time he'd seen the victim, because he stated that that was the last time he'd seen Jesse till he had to identify his body on the day of the homicide on the 5th. I asked him if he was certain about that, and he said, well, that he might have seen him at his place of employment, which was the Campus Inn, which is no longer standing, but at the Campus Inn, he'd seen him. Defendant told me that all contacts with Jesse were in the official capacity, and he always had his uniform on. I asked him again about that, if that was, if he was certain about that, and he said that he'd actually visited with Jesse one time in plain clothes. I then informed him that we had received a Crime Stopper report stating that that Jesse was having an affair with a police officer, and that he was actually the police officer that had arrested him. I also asked him about going over to the apartment, and he said he'd only been in contact with official capacity and uniform, and then I brought up the fact that we'd already interviewed a witness by the name of Joan Sheridan. Joan had told us that she was at Jesse's house one night when the defendant showed up. At that time, the defendant became distraught. He took his glasses off and cried a little while, and basically he asked if he could convince me that he wasn't involved in this murder, and I basically told him if he'd start telling the truth. And Sergeant Monticelli come running back and said that the defendant had called and stated that he had done something bad. It was kind of hectic, I think it kind of set Captain Monticelli a little back, and he said, hey, you're trained to do this, you talk to him. So I got on the phone, and I asked the defendant what was going on, and he said, I did something bad, and in training through a crisis negotiation, if you think somebody's suicidal, you just ask them. You just cut right to it, say, are you planning on hurting yourself? And he said that he was. He said he'd purchased a shotgun and some shotgun shells and was thinking about killing himself. And I asked him, I kind of had to change gears in my opinion. Crisis negotiation is try to get somebody to resolve things in a good way. So I said, well, Steve, have you gone to your wife about this? And he said he had. And I said, well, have you told her everything about this affair with Jesse Valencia? And he said he had. And I said, well, what'd she say? And basically he said that she told him that she was going to stick by him and everything, they were going to work things out. And I told him, I said, well, if you didn't kill him and she's going to stick by you, why are you running? The hard part's over in my opinion. You've got the things at home fixed. If you didn't kill him, we're okay. It's time to come home. His next statement to me was, John, every time I talk to you, something goes bad. And he hung up and he wouldn't talk to me again.
Detective Short's testimony painted Steven Rios in an unflattering and downright suspicious light. But under cross-examination, he grudgingly admitted that he could not prove that Steven Rios carried or even owned a clip knife.
Did you contact people who knew Steven Rios socially to see if any of them had any evidence of him owning a clip knife?
I believe so.
Did you or did you not? Not why I believe so.
Sir, I asked everybody that I talked to. If you can bring me a name, I could be more specific on who I talked to.
Well, you did agree that you have talked to, numerous people?
Yes, sir.
And nobody came forward that you talked to as far as social acquaintances who said they ever saw Steven Rios with a clip knife?
I'll agree to that, yes, sir.
This was a big hit for the prosecution, and things got even worse when the defense addressed the issue of how Officer Rios ended up at a crime scene when he was off duty.
You're aware that Steven was asked to go to the scene to ID Mr. Valencia's body.
Yes.
He didn't volunteer.
Well, I wasn't there when this was done. I was going by what he told me.
Okay. Did you follow up to confirm his story?
I didn't talk to those officers.
So you had no reason not to believe him at that moment?
No.
As the multi-week trial drew to a close, the defense called two of its own experts to the stand to counter testimony provided by prosecution witnesses.
I had records from a variety of places, including the medical examiner's report here, both their intake report as well as the autopsy report. I had a description of the scene by the police. I had Mr. Valencia's, or at least some of his medical records. I had Dr. Rao's testimony from a couple of proceedings. And I also had photographs taken of the scene where the body was found, as well as the body itself when it got to the morgue.
So as part of what you viewed, various autopsy photos?
Yes.
And you viewed various photos of the body as it was found at the scene?
Yes.
Now, as part of you doing this, giving us this opinion and giving us this testimony, you also reviewed Mr. Valencia's medical records?
Yes.
Okay. Now, overall, I'm sorry, and then also, as you said, you reviewed Dr. Rao's, the medical examiner that was here at the time, her reports.
Yes.
And also some previous sworn testimony that she gave.
Yes.
Very well. Now, in all fairness to Dr. Rao, on many areas, you agree with how she did and what she did.
Yes.
Very well. But you did, after reviewing all the stuff that we gave you, you did have some disagreement with Dr. Rao.
A couple of disagreements.
And would you be kind enough to share with the jury your disagreement?
At least in the first proceeding of Dr. Rao's that I saw testimony, she said that she couldn't tell whether Mr. Valencia was up or lying down when his throat was cut. And I think you can tell by looking at the photographs at the scene. So that was one disagreement. Dr. Rao changed her opinion. And in the second time she testified, she thought that he was lying down. The other disagreement that I have with Dr. Rao is that I think she was pretty sure that the knife had a serrated edge or a sawtooth edge. And I'm not sure that that's correct. I can't say that it's not a serrated blade, but I'm not convinced that it is. I think the marks that she was using to say that it's serrated, I'm not convinced are from serration.
Now, doctor, you examined the records, and out of the 7 nanograms of DNA, were you able to distinguish different types of DNA?
Yes, the 7.8 nanograms was a mixture of at least 3 individuals. And based on the relative peak heights from the results from the laboratory, I can roughly calculate how much DNA was from each individual.
And did you make that calculation?
Yes, I calculated that Rios' DNA constituted approximately 22% of the total. So that means out of that 7.8 nanograms of DNA, approximately 1.72 nanograms could be attributed to Rios.
Now, how did you come to the determination there were 3 individuals in that mixture?
Well, each of us has 2 copies of every gene, one from mom and one from dad. So at the most, you would have 2 alleles or 2 alternative forms of a particular gene. So in the analysis, the results show us how many alleles there are. If there are 2, then that could be 1 person or 2 person. That is, 1 person that has 2 alleles that are the same, or 2 people, each of them having 1 allele. If there are more than 2 peaks, if there are 3 peaks, then that tells us there has to be a 3rd person. Now, in this case, there are instances where there are 6 peaks. So there must have been at least 3 donors.
So, out of 7.8 nanograms of DNA, 3 individuals, you determined that, pardon me, you determined that 22% was Steven Rios.
Correct.
And were you able to identify who the other 2 are?
Yeah, the other one, the major donor was Valencia.
And was there another donor you were able to identify?
Yes, the minor donor would be consistent with McDevitt.
Can DNA stay outside the body and stay viable for testing?
For an extended period, yes.
So again, does that go back to why you can't really tell how long DNA is on a person's body, how long it's been there?
That's correct, yes.
You can also get DNA under your fingernails from something like DNA on a counter, and you run your hand across the counter and something like that, can't you?
Yes.
DNA is extremely easily transferable.
Yes.
And doctor, in your opinion, as an expert in this field, if there are limb hairs on a comforter or on a bed sheet, and a person lays down on that, that hair can be easily transferred to that person's body.
Yes.
And would you agree with me that there's no way to know how long that DNA on that hair was on that body?
That's correct, yes. There's no way to tell.
Afterward, the defense called 2 officers who claimed that Steven Rios was with them on the roof of the police building until nearly 5 a.m. in the morning on Saturday, June the 5th of 2004.
Lieutenant, that you joined Mr. Rios and some of your other fellow officers on the roof of the Columbia PD.
Yes, sir.
And who all was, when you got there, who all was there?
Steve Rios, Jerry Green, Jason Jones, and there was a female. I've since learned her name. At the time, I did not know her name, that worked in communications.
And now that you know her name, who is it?
I believe it's Leah Wooden, but I did not know her name at the time.
Now, how long did you stay?
Ballpark of 15 minutes.
So what time did you leave?
Around 4:45.
And when you left at 4:45, who was still on the roof?
All of the people we've mentioned, the female, Rios, Green, and Jones.
Would you state your full name, please?
Jason Jones.
Did you work on the same shift with Officer Rios?
I did.
In June of 04?
I did.
And that would be the shift that begins at 6:30 and gets off at 3?
Correct.
And do you recall around June of 04 having a gathering on the roof of the Columbia PD?
I do.
Now, we've heard it described different ways. Take a minute and describe the roof setting of the Columbia PD.
Physically?
Describe where you all were.
To the best of my recollection, we were, if you can think of it as the top of the garage is divided in two what I would call a north side and a south side. And we were on the west end, right in the middle, right where the two are divided.
This get together after your shift?
Yes, sir.
Is that something you all had done before?
Yes, we had done it before.
How did this one get started?
I don't recall. I don't recall if it was something that was how far in advance it was planned.
Well, about what time did it start?
To the best of my recollection, I would estimate 3:30.
Okay, and who was the first one up on the, let's call it the roof?
I believe I was.
Well, let me ask you this point. Who do you recall up there?
I recall Mr. Rios, Jerry Green, Leah Wooden, Scott Young came eventually, and at one point, one of the supervisors for Joint Communications came onto the roof briefly, but she wasn't there to socialize. She was just there to make sure that I was out of service.
All right, so how long do you think you were up there?
Total? Over an hour.
Now, there came a time when your group, the group that was drinking, and I mean excessively, they were having beer,
Sure.
broke up.
Yes.
Started going on.
Yes, sir.
And do you recall who was the first one? First of all, allow me this. Do you recall you commenting about the sun coming up?
I remember making a comment about day breaking. In the far, I guess, northeast sky, I believe the sky started to lighten up. I never saw the sun, but in that far corner of the sky, it started to lighten up. And I believe I made a comment about that.
Okay. Well, so you make the comment that day's breaking. You just indicated that minutes passed after that before you all started to break up.
Yes.
And then who was the first person to leave?
I know that Scott Young had left first. I don't recall if he was there when that comment was made or if he had already left. He was the first person to leave.
All right. And then who left next?
Mr. Rios left.
This was a powerful way for the defense to end the trial because they claimed that Jesse Valencia was murdered while Officer Rios was drinking beer with fellow officers on the roof of the police building.
Ladies and gentlemen, jury, Steven Arthur Rios committed a despicable crime. He used his badge for sex, and he used his knife to forever close the mouth of his secret lover. Jesse Valencia was playing with fire when he submitted these sexual advances of the officer who arrested him on April 18th at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he paid for that. He played with fire, and it cost him his life.
Yes, that man's arm hair was found on the chest of Jesse Valencia right where he was being choked. Remember, Jason Wyckoff told you how many people are on the planet. Only 7 billion. Remember, we look at these statistics, that we aren't talking just billions here. And we aren't talking hundreds of thousands, millions, billions. You know, there are 7 billion people on the planet. That's how many people on the planet. We go way beyond that. We're in the trillion range. If all you had was the 0.6, it'd be 1 in 600 billion people would match. We have 1 in 757.6 trillion people would match. He's a match. If that is not proof beyond reasonable doubt, all by itself, what is? Let's talk too about the hairs on the bedsheet. Because these hairs weren't just found on his chest, there were also 2 of them, among the many hairs on his bed, there were 2 of them that were limb hairs checking this defendant. What does that prove? It proves this defendant was in that man's bed at some point. This defendant, who was originally starting out saying, I only knew him in a professional manner, I only had professional contact with him. That all by itself, even if you didn't have the hair on the chest, the hairs in the bed, with his denials that he had had any kind of relationship with him, is strong proof. So we know for sure he's been in the bed. And you know, the defense has come up with this bizarre theory that, well, because he had been with him at some point a week or so earlier, that Jesse's body must have been like a vacuum cleaner, sucking up these hairs out of his bed, so he's walking around with Steven Rios hairs on him 24/7. That's ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. And here's something else. If he's an innocent man, he is a police officer that finds out this friend of his, this young boy he had had sex with, has been murdered. He knows that he was there on the night Andy Sherman was there. He may not know Andy Sherman's name, but he knows now there's a potential suspect maybe, because I know that Jesse was having sex with this boy. If you're innocent, you would say, I'm going to speak up and mention, well, you know what? I did have a social relationship with this boy, and I was there one night and saw that he had sex with this Andy Schernermark. He didn't do any of that. Instead, he lied. Instead, he tells Monticelli, you know what? I think maybe it's Brad Anderson, the police officer, that might be having an affair with him. I think maybe it's Mike Valley. He was putting out these false trails because he's a liar and because he's a killer.
It's a wonderful, wonderful country. Our founding fathers came over and said, hey, we're going to make sure people are treated fairly. And they put this in there. The defendant presumed to be innocent unless and until, during your deliberations, upon your verdict, you find him guilty. This presumption of innocence places upon the state the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. A reasonable doubt is a doubt based upon reason and common sense. And as we go through this next ever how long journey, as I take you through how I believe the evidence is, I'm going to ask that as we take this journey, you take common sense along with us. Have a careful and impartial consideration of all, not just what they picked and choose and what he talked about up here a few minutes ago, but of all the evidence. And evidence, not supposition, not maybes, not I believes, we think this happened, we got a feeling this happened. No. Evidence in the case. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you firmly convinced of the defendant's guilt. Wonderful. Disturbance gets out of hand. Mr. Valencia hits the door and runs the length of 2 football fields plus 2 more first downs. 652 feet. He runs. A couple minutes. In between these buildings. Secluded? Are you kidding me? Apartment building, 3 feet away, windows everywhere. You saw the pictures. Apartment building, 3 feet away. You saw the pictures. Clear view to the houses across the street. You saw the pictures. So don't be fooled by this secluded area thing that the state wishes you to do. Something horrific happens. You saw the state's exhibit from Dr. Rao that they put right here, and she had marked in red all the injuries, and it was covered. Covered. She took a long time to list all the injuries when she sat up on that seat and said, I listed them for you. And the AC unit, this tall, this big around, had been dislodged. Something happened there, folks. Something horrific. Couple minutes. And then, well, you gotta go back and get your car. So another 2 football fields and another 2 first downs back to Mr. Valencia's apartment. Couple more minutes. But man, you gotta clean up. You gotta find somewhere to clean up. And you gotta clean up so well that there is no trace of blood, grass, dirt, perspiration. And then once you get done cleaning yourself, well, I guess you had to change your clothes, so you had to get rid of your clothes. Then, even after you've accomplished that, you've got to clean your car. You've got to get in your car, the car you used to travel over to Mr. Valencia's apartment. You've got to get in that car, and you've got to go through that just like these CSI people do, because, hey, you're covering up your crime. I really had trouble trying to give a time to that. But let's say 10 or 15 minutes. Cleaning your body up, then maybe another 5 minutes or so cleaning the car. Now, as you bring common sense along with me, you're sitting there going, how in the world could anybody do it in that amount of time? Because please recall, folks, Mr. Rios' house was searched top to bottom. You heard when they got back, it was a disaster area. They luminoled it. They pulled drains. They did everything that they were supposed to do, and they found nothing. But it wasn't Steven Rios. Because at 3:05, 3:10, he was at the Columbia Police Department doing what he does so well, which was loving and being a police officer. That's what he loved. So there was a car that woke up a neighbor. So if the simple little fact of a car pulling up and a door opening would wake up Mrs. Hammond, can you imagine how difficult it would be in daylight? Because again, something the state doesn't want you to know. But at 4:45-ish or so, Jason Jones says, hey guys, we gotta go home. Daylight's coming. Leah Wooten said around 4:45 that she was there. So they said that that's when the party broke up, because she heard somebody say, daylight is coming, and you heard Jason Jones admit it was him. And when that happened, where was Steven Rios? He was standing a few feet away from him, enjoying a cold one, or maybe he might have finished up. So, to believe the state, you would have to believe that someone was able to pull this off in daylight in a busy neighborhood with a noisy neighbor and houses on top of each other. Again, they ridiculed Steven's stories as ridiculous. Folks, that's the very definition of a ridiculous story. Remember again how easy Dr. Stetler said that DNA can be transferred, and recall how he said how easy it is for hair to be transferred. Simple as touching each other. It's as simple as during sex, grabbing each other, a moment of passion, digging it a little bit, and that's how easy it was. Of course, they leapt on and said, yeah, but it could also be from all bunch of scratching. Well, that might hold water if it wasn't for this finding. Fine. State, show me a scratch. Please, we'll wait. No, not a single scratch. But Dr. Stetler said it certainly could come from sex. And my client, yes, he lied about it, but my client had sex. My client didn't beat this man. My client didn't kill this man. My client had sex with this man. And that's why we're not talking about injuries and such. We're talking about a tiny little bit of DNA under a fingernail.
On the afternoon of May the 27th, 2005, after just 9 hours of deliberation, the Clay County jury informed the bailiff that they had reached a decision.
As to count one, we, the jury, find the defendant, Steven Arthur Rios, guilty of murder in the second degree, is submitted in instruction number 7, and the verdict has been signed by your foreperson. Is this your verdict? And so say each member of this jury.
Yes. Yes.
Does either party desire to have the jury polled?
No, sir. No, sir.
As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant, Steven Arthur Rios, guilty of armed criminal action, as submitted in instruction number 10. And again, the verdict has been signed by your foreperson. Is this your verdict? And so say each member of this jury.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is a matter that I have to take up with the attorneys. You still have some work to do in this case. I'm going to send you back to your jury room. Please don't talk about the case again, until you are returned to the courtroom to receive additional information and evidence in the case. At this time, you may return to your jury room.
Steven Rios was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for using a weapon during the commission of a crime. But more than a year later, his conviction was overturned when an appellate judge ruled that hearsay had been admitted during the first trial. This was a huge win, and Steven Rios' legal team got another chance to argue the case when a new trial got underway in December of 2008. That said, he was subsequently convicted of second-degree murder and armed criminal action, for which he received a nearly identical sentence to the one handed down in 2005. Jesse Valencia was eventually buried on his family's farm in Perryville, Kentucky, and since the very beginning, former police officer Steven Rios has adamantly denied killing him. Steven Rios may have summed it up best during an interview with Dateline's Keith Morrison in 2020, when he said, "Some people think I'm a killer. Some people think I'm not. You know, I know, I'm not."